Chapter 9. The Profile Evidence. Did Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? Shortly after 8 student nurses were murdered in a Chicago apartment, the trembling lone survivor huddled with a police sketch artist and described in detail the killer she had seen from her secret vantage point beneath a bed. Quickly, the drawing was flashed around the city, to police officers, to hospitals, to transit stations, to the airport. Soon, an emergency room physician called detectives to say he was treating a man who looked suspiciously like the flinty-eyed fugitive depicted in the sketch. That's how police arrested a drifter named Richard Speck, who was promptly convicted of the heinous slayings and ended up dying in prison 30 years later. Ever since Scotland Yard first turned a witness's recollections into a sketch of a murder suspect in 1889, forensic artists have played an important role in law enforcement. Today, more than 300 sketch artists work with U.S. police agencies, and an increasing number of departments are relying on a computerized system called EFIT, Electronic Facial Identification Technique. This recently developed technology was successfully used to solve a 1997 kidnapping that occurred at a shopping mall just a few miles from my suburban Chicago home. The victim provided details about the kidnapper's appearance to a technician, who used a computer to create an electronic likeness of the offender by choosing from different styles of noses, mouths, hairlines, and so forth. Just moments after the drawing was faxed to police agencies throughout the area, an investigator in another suburb recognized the picture as a dead ringer for a criminal he had encountered earlier. Fortunately, this led to the quick arrest of the kidnapping suspect. Oddly enough, the concept of an artist's drawing can provide a rough analogy that can help us in our quest for the truth about Jesus. Here's how. The Old Testament provides numerous details about God that sketch out in great specificity what he's like. For instance, God is described as omnipresent, or existing everywhere in the universe, as omniscient, or knowing everything that can be known throughout eternity, as omnipotent, or all-powerful, as eternal, or being both beyond time and the source of all time, and as immutable, or unchanging in his attributes. He's loving, he's holy, he's righteous, he's wise, he's just. Now, Jesus claims to be God. But does he fulfill these characteristics of deity? In other words, if we examine Jesus carefully, does his likeness closely match the sketch of God that we find elsewhere in the Bible? If it doesn't, we can conclude that his claim to being God is false. This is an extremely complex and mind-stretching issue. For example, when Jesus was delivering the Sermon on the Mount on a hillside outside Capernaum, he wasn't simultaneously standing on Main Street of Jericho. So, in what sense could he be called omnipresent? How can he be called omniscient if he readily admits in Mark 13, verse 32, that he doesn't know everything about the future? If he's eternal, why does Colossians 1, verse 15, call him the firstborn over all creation? On the surface, these issues seem to suggest that Jesus doesn't resemble the sketch of God. Nevertheless, I've learned over the years that initial impressions can be deceiving. That's why I was glad I would be able to discuss these issues with Dr. D.A. Carson, the theologian who has emerged in recent years as one of the most distinguished thinkers in Christianity. The Eighth Interview. Donald A. Carson, Ph.D. D.A. Carson, a research professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, has written or edited more than 40 books, including The Sermon on the Mount, Exegetical Fallacies, The Gospel According to John, and the award-winning The Gagging of God. He can read a dozen languages. His mastery of French stems from a childhood spent in Quebec, and is a member of the Tyndale Fellowship for Biblical Research, the Society for Biblical Literature, and the Institute for Biblical Research. His areas of expertise include the historical Jesus, postmodernism, Greek grammar, and the theology of the apostles Paul and John. After initially studying chemistry, receiving a Bachelor of Science degree from McGill University, Carson went on to receive a Master of Divinity degree before going to England, where he earned a doctorate in New Testament at prestigious Cambridge University. He taught at 3 other colleges and seminaries before joining Trinity in 1978. I had never met Carson before I drove to Trinity's Deerfield, Illinois campus for our interview. Frankly, I was expecting a starched academic. But while I found Carson to be every bit the scholar I had anticipated, I was taken aback by his warm, sincere, and pastoral tone as he responded to what turned out to be, in some cases, rather caustic questions. Our conversation was held in an otherwise deserted faculty lounge over Christmas break. Carson was wearing a white windbreaker over a button-down shirt, blue jeans, and Adidas shoes. After some preliminary banter about our mutual appreciation of England — Carson has lived there off and on through the years, and his wife Joy is British — I pulled out my notebook, started my recorder, and posed a background question to help determine whether Jesus has the right stuff to be God. My initial question centered on why Carson thinks Jesus is God in the first place. What did he say or do, I asked, that convinces you that he is divine? I wasn't sure how he would respond, although I anticipated he would focus on Jesus' supernatural feats. I was wrong. One could point to such things as his miracles, Carson said as he leaned back in the comfortably upholstered chair. But other people have done miracles, so while this may be indicative, it's not decisive. Of course, the resurrection was the ultimate vindication of his identity. But of the many things he did, one of the most striking to me is his forgiving of sin. Really, I said, shifting in my chair, which was perpendicular to his, in order to face him more directly. How so? The point is, if you do something against me, I have the right to forgive you. However, if you do something against me and somebody else comes along and says, I forgive you, what kind of cheek is that? The only person who can say that sort of thing meaningfully is God himself, because sin, even if it is against other people, is first and foremost a defiance of God and his laws. When David sinned by committing adultery and arranging the death of the woman's husband, he ultimately says to God in Psalm 51, Against you, only you have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight. He recognized that although he had wronged people, in the end he had sinned against the God who made him in his image, and God needed to forgive him. So along comes Jesus and says to sinners, I forgive you. The Jews immediately recognize the blasphemy of this. They react by saying, Who can forgive sins but God alone? To my mind, that is one of the most striking things Jesus did. Not only did Jesus forgive sins, I observed, but he asserted that he himself was without sin, and certainly sinlessness is an attribute of deity. Yes, he replied. Historically in the West, people considered most holy have also been the most conscious of their own failures and sins. They are people who are aware of their shortcomings and lusts and resentments, and they're fighting them honestly by the grace of God. In fact, they're fighting them so well that others take notice and say, there is a holy man or woman. But along comes Jesus, who can say with a straight face, Which of you can convict me of sin? If I said that, my wife and children and all who know me would be glad to stand up and testify, whereas no one could with respect to Christ. Although moral perfection and the forgiveness of sin are undoubtedly characteristics of deity, there are several additional attributes that Jesus must fulfill if he is to match the sketch of God. It was time to progress to those. After having started by lobbing softballs at Carson, I got ready to throw some curves. Using some notes I had brought along, I hit Carson in rapid-fire succession with some of the biggest obstacles to Jesus' claim of deity. Dr. Carson, how in the world could Jesus be omnipresent if he couldn't be in 2 places at once? I asked. How could he be omniscient when he says, not even the Son of Man knows the hour of his return? How could he be omnipotent when the Gospels plainly tell us that he was unable to do many miracles in his hometown? Pointing my pen at him for emphasis, I concluded by saying, let's admit it. The Bible itself seems to argue against Jesus being God. While Carson didn't flinch, he did concede that these questions have no simple answers. After all, they strike at the very heart of the incarnation. God becoming man, spirit taking on flesh, the infinite becoming finite, the eternal becoming time-bound. It's a doctrine that has kept theologians busy for decades. And that's where Carson chose to start his answer, by going back to the way scholars have tried to respond to these matters through the years. Historically, there have been 2 or 3 approaches to this, he began, sounding a bit as if he were beginning a classroom lecture. For example, at the end of the last century, the great theologian Benjamin Warfield worked through the Gospels and ascribed various bits to either Christ's humanity or to his deity. When Jesus does something that's a reflection of him being God, that's ascribed to Christ's deity. When there's something reflecting his limitations or finiteness or his humanness, for example, his tears, does God cry? That's ascribed to his humanity. That explanation was fraught with problems, it seemed to me. If you do that, wouldn't you end up with a schizophrenic Jesus? I asked. It's easy to slip into that unwittingly, he replied. All the confessional statements have insisted that both Jesus' humanity and his deity remain distinct, yet they combined in one person. So you want to avoid a solution in which there are essentially 2 minds, sort of a Jesus human mind and a Christ heavenly mind. However, this is one kind of solution, and there may be something to it. It's a doctrine that has kept theologians busy for centuries. The other kind of solution is some form of kenosis, which means emptying. This spins out of Philippians chapter 2, where Paul tells us that Jesus, being in the form of God, did not think equality with God was something to be exploited. That's the way it should be translated. But emptied himself. He became a nobody. That seemed a little ambiguous to me. Can you be more explicit? I asked. What exactly did he empty himself of? Apparently, I had put my finger on the issue. Ah, that's the question, Carson replied with a nod. Through the centuries, people have given various answers to that. For instance, did he empty himself of his deity? Well, then he would no longer be God. Did he empty himself of the attributes of his deity? I have a problem with that too, because it's difficult to separate attributes from reality. If you have an animal that looks like a horse, smells like a horse, walks like a horse, and has all the attributes of a horse, you've got a horse. So I don't know what it means for God to empty himself of his attributes and still be God. Some have said that he didn't empty himself of his attributes, but he emptied himself on the use of his attributes, a self-limiting type of thing. That's getting closer, although there are times when that was not what he was doing. He was forgiving sins the way only God can, which is an attribute of deity. Others go further by saying he emptied himself of the independent use of his attributes. That is, he functioned like God when his heavenly Father gave him explicit sanction to do so. Now, that's much closer. The difficulty is that there is a sense in which the eternal Son has always acted in line with his Father's commandments. You don't want to lose that, even in eternity past, but it's getting closer. I sensed we were somewhere in the vicinity of the bullseye, but I wasn't sure we were going to get much closer. That seemed to be Carson's sentiment too. Strictly speaking, he said, Philippians 2 does not tell us precisely what the eternal Son emptied himself of. He emptied himself. He became a nobody. Some kind of emptying is at issue, but let's be frank. You're talking about the incarnation, one of the central mysteries of the Christian faith. You're dealing with formless, bodiless, omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent spirit, and finite, touchable, physical, time-bound creatures. For one to become the other inevitably binds you up in mysteries. So part of Christian theology has been concerned not with explaining it all away, but with trying to take the biblical evidence and, retaining all of it fairly, find ways of synthesis that are rationally coherent, even if they're not exhaustively explanatory. That was a sophisticated way of saying that theologians can come up with explanations that seem to make sense, even though they might not be able to explain every nuance about the incarnation. In a way, that seemed logical. If the incarnation is true, it's not surprising that finite minds couldn't totally comprehend it. It seemed to me that some sort of voluntary emptying of Jesus' independent use of his attributes was reasonable in explaining why he didn't exhibit the omnis, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence in his earthly existence, even though the New Testament clearly states that all of these qualities are ultimately true of him. That, however, was only part of the problem. I flipped to the next page of my notes and began another line of questioning about some specific biblical passages that seemed to directly contradict Jesus' claim to being God. Part of the sketch that Jesus must match is that God is an uncreated being who existed from eternity past. Isaiah 57, verse 15, describes God as He who lives forever. But, I said to Carson, there are some verses that seem to strongly suggest that Jesus was a created being. For instance, I said, John 3:16 calls Jesus the begotten Son of God. And Colossians 1, verse 15 says he was the firstborn over all creation. Don't they clearly imply that Jesus was created, as opposed to being the creator? One of Carson's areas of expertise is Greek grammar, which he called upon in responding to both of those verses. Let's take John 3:16, he said. It's the King James Version that translates the Greek with the words, His only begotten Son. Those who consider this the correct rendering usually bind that up with the incarnation itself, that is, the begetting in the Virgin Mary. But in fact, that's not what the word in Greek means. It really means unique one. The way it was usually used in the first century is unique and beloved. So John 3:16 is simply saying that Jesus is the unique and beloved Son, or as the New International Version translates it, the one and only Son, rather than saying he is ontologically begotten in time. Okay, that only explains that one passage, I pointed out. Okay, let's look at the Colossians verse, which uses the term firstborn. The vast majority of commentators, whether conservative or liberal, recognize that in the Old Testament, the firstborn, because of the laws of succession, normally received the lion's share of the estate, or the firstborn would become king in the case of a royal family. The firstborn, therefore, was the one ultimately with all the rights of the father. By the 2nd century before Christ, there are places where the word no longer has any notion of actual begetting or of being born first, but carries the idea of the authority that comes with the position of being the rightful heir. That's the way it applies to Jesus, as virtually all scholars admit. In light of that, the very expression firstborn is slightly misleading. What would be a better translation, I asked. I think supreme heir would be more appropriate, he responded. While that would explain the Colossians passage, Carson went even further with one last point. If you're going to quote Colossians 1, verse 15, you have to keep it in context by going to Colossians 2, verse 9, where the very same author stresses, For in Christ all the fullness of deity lives in bodily form. The author wouldn't contradict himself, so the term firstborn cannot exclude Jesus' eternality, since that is part of what it means to possess the fullness of the divine. For me, that nailed the issue. But there were other troubling passages as well. For example, in Mark 10, someone addresses Jesus as good teacher, prompting him to reply, Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone. Wasn't he denying his divinity by saying this? I asked. No, I think he was trying to get the fellow to stop and think about what he was saying, Carson explained. The parallel passage in Matthew is a little more expansive and does not find Jesus downplaying his deity at all. I think all he's saying is, wait a minute, why are you calling me good? Is this just a polite thing, like you say good day? What do you mean by good? You call me good master. Is this because you're trying to honey up to me?